Situated at the crossroads of Europe and Asia, and at the intersection of 3 points of regional instability, it's no wonder that Turkey was on the defensive during the Cold War period and had to rely on its NATO allies to deter the threat coming from the Warsaw Pact countries. The collapse of the Soviet Union marked the turning point in Turkey's national security strategy, from a defensive to an autonomous and more assertive role. The Gulf crisis, soon after the end of the Cold War and the increasing instability in the Middle East, showed Turkey that there was space for an ambitious military power to expand its influence over its borders. Turkey, however, was not the only country to understand the opportunities that came with the collapse of the Soviet Union. While for the US the value of the other European countries was declining, that of the Turkey was increasing. Turkey's role shifted from fighting communism to fighting instability, terrorism, and Islamic fundamentalism, while returning its role as a listening post to monitor Russian movements and possessing advanced air bases, allowing US air forces to be able to project power right into the Middle East. This can be one of the reasons that could explain why, starting from 1984, US arms exports toward Turkey increased by quite a big margin. Just take a look. From 1984 to 1987, US weapons exports to Turkey have been as large as the entire value of US arm transfers to Turkey during the 34 years from 1950 to 1983. An average of $700 million per year, making Turkey one of the largest recipients of US arms during the 90s, ranking just right below Saudi Arabia, Taiwan, Israel, and Egypt. This occurred despite 1984 being the year in which Turkey's civil war against PKK erupted. 8 of the 10.5 billions have been directly or indirectly subsidized under 3 major US security assistance programs, so US taxpayers definitely helped with Turkey rearmament. In addition, Turkey was a prime beneficiary of surplus US weapons deliveries. Turkey received a truly impressive arsenal of equipment, just considering the period from 1990 to 1998. This is not all anyway. What is even more important, US defense companies helped Turkey to lay the foundations of a solid indigenous defense industry. Under the 4 Peace Onyx programs from 1987 to 2011, Turkey was capable to domestically produce over 240 F-16s, the vast majority of which were assembled at TAI's Ankara facility. With Peace Onyx program, Lockheed Martin provided Turkey with technology, training, and financing to establish a foothold in the military aerospace production. The same applied for armored personnel carriers, trucks, tanks, instruments, and equipment like optical sights and night vision, and so on. Turkey's evident adventurism comes today at a time when military modernization has reached a point of giving Turkey capabilities that exceed those of any single neighbor. Turkey armored forces are numerically the second biggest in NATO after US ones, with a troop strength of 355,000 active military forces. The army political role has been reduced, but military service is highly respected by the population, and it's safe to assume that the willingness of the Turkish population to be enlisted in case of war will be high, and thus Turkey can field a very large standing army. This is a precious asset, especially considering the potential high number of trained conscripts fit for service, and this certainly adds to Turkey's overall defensive capabilities. Turkey is on the cusp of creating its own space agency, and many progresses are being made in building the necessary infrastructures and establishing relationships with other space agencies. Yet, Turkey has to cope with many problems: dispute in determining how civilians and military should share authority, budget allocation, qualified personnel, and relative lack of interest for space sciences in universities' programs. The recent launch of Göktürk first military satellite, however, provide Turkey military forces with localized information superiority relative to its neighbors. In spite of the numbers, Turkey's main battle tanks forces consist mainly of very outdated tanks. There is really nothing to do to make M48 pattern tanks feel younger on the battlefield, and M60s have seen better days. It is a slightly different story for German Leopard tanks. Half of Leopard 1 tanks have been locally upgraded to a version called Leopard 1T Vulcan to extend life for a further decade, while Leopard 2 can be considered modern. The process to mass-produce Mitüp Altay, first Turkey indigenous tank, has started, with an order of 1,000 tanks to be produced in 4 batches. This will be a huge leap toward modernization of Turkish armored forces, and these units will constitute a very effective spearhead for any offensive moves. ACV armored personnel carriers are among the most modern APCs in the Turkish inventory. The rest, it's old equipment, though still valuable. Anyway, its anti-mine, anti-improvised explosive devices armored components should be increased to be able to contrast both PKK and terrorist anti-armor explosive threats. The same applies for Turkey artillery pieces, great in numbers, but many of them are old. Considering its borders, Turkey relies a lot on its artillery. Therefore, a modernization program will prove very useful. The stories behind Turkey's acquisition of a missile system is really interesting and proves how fast Turkey is growing both in military power and assertiveness, and how autonomous from its NATO allies nowadays. One of the countries part of the NATO nuclear sharing program, Turkey vehemence in obtaining technology transfer and production license in Turkey for the US M270 multiple launch rocket system led Turkey to start cooperate with China in the first half of the 90s, the production of which was a derivative of the Chinese solid-fuel short-range ballistic missile B611, the J-600T Yildirim, that means Thunderbolt. What is more striking is the deal recently signed with Russia. The acquisition of Russia S-400 Triumph advanced anti-aircraft surface-to-air defense system over US and European allies' refusal to renew their Patriot missile deployments in southern Turkey. This means that suddenly Turkish will get their hands on an advanced multi-layered ballistic and anti-aircraft defense system. The increasing quality of the Turkish naval forces is typical of the growth and methods adopted by the Turkish armed forces in general. After joining NATO, Turkey relied on second-hand ships from the US and Europe. Later, they began production in-country at their naval shipyard facilities, using licensed designs, most of the time German in origin, and complete material packages including the steel, onboard equipment, command systems and weapons. This provided a very good experience for Turkey naval shipyards. Buoyed by the experience gained in these joint ventures, Turkey launched in 1996 the Miljan project for the design, development and construction of completely indigenous corvettes, 2 of which, out of class, have been already commissioned. At the same time, 6 Type 214 air-independent propulsion diesel-electric submarines are expected to substitute the oldest of the Turkish Type 209 submarines, the Atılay class. In general, although lacking the force projection of a blue water navy, Turkish naval forces seems more and more able to assert their influence over their littoral zone. Turkey fleet composition reflects this transition, from a defensive littoral fleet to a green water navy. With modern ships and a growing shipbuilding capability, Turkey Navy would need larger surface ships, cruisers or at least dedicated anti-surface warfare ships, a better logistic and support fleet, and at least a light aircraft carrier to transition to a regional blue water navy. Nonetheless, Turkey might not be interested to upgrade its fleet to increase its force projection. We think that this is not something to be put first in a list of strategic priorities. Someone might suppose everything Turkey wants is to expand where once there was a mighty empire, the Ottoman Empire. For this purpose, a fleet capable of defending key nodes with amphibious capabilities and the ability to support land forces may be enough to sustain Turkish increasing ambitions. The Turkish Air Force is perhaps the armored force branch that has been impacted the most by the modernization program. When the Gulf crisis erupted in the 90s, the deficiency in the air was striking. Only 50 to 60 were F-16s, while the vast bulk of the air forces consisted of planes of the Vietnam War and even Korean War. Starting with a procurement campaign to acquire more F-16 and then produce them by itself thanks to US Lockheed Martin direct offset deal so as to get a more pronounced modern deep strike capability, Turkey acquired the necessary experience that led to the development of an indigenous industry. Nowadays, Turkey Air Force, if not the best equipped, is for sure one of the most ambitious in Europe. There is in fact a new indigenous superiority fighter, Turkish Aerospace Industry TFX, in development, and a deal for the acquisition of 116 F-35A Lightning II. The coming years will see Turkey armored forces boost by increasing military spending in a position of preeminence in Europe and dominance in the Middle East. For the time being, the biggest problem to face is that of the raging conflict between Kemalists, secularism, mainly supported by the armed forces, and Islamists, supported by President Erdogan itself and others. The 2016 military coup, its failure, and the following epurations left the military dangerously understaffed, especially the Air Force, a very big issue for a country that relies on strong air forces to protect its large airspace. In the future, we will know if from this trade-off between loyalty and merit, a military ruling class will emerge prepared to face the enormous challenges of a country that lives in a very, very tough neighborhood.